I hope you are enjoying your wonderful time at the conference. We have definitely been on a journey from the past, exploring trailblazers, a journey of today, and now we're ready for our journey to the future. The next panel, A Burst of Light, Future Trends and Emerging Movements in the Queer Community, will be moderated by none other than Bathita Carter. Bathia is the president and CEO of Give Black Alliance. She's very passionate about philanthropy, leveraging community assets to improve education, workforce, and economic development opportunities for Black and Brown-led organizations. Without any further ado, our next panel. You ready? Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. You sound sleepy. I don't know how after that electric, thank you so much. I wouldn't call it a speech. I would call it a call to action. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to think about what you heard. We're going to take a 10-minute break and then come back at 1:30 because we're going to get started at 1:35 with our conversation. So when we come back and say good afternoon, I hope you sound a little more energized. Get some food, get some drink, and we'll be back at 1:35. Oh, you're so much beautiful, more beautiful in person. Is she? Everybody's so rude.
Yeah. Oh, you know.
You. I ordered it on Amazon like 4 years ago and forgot about it.
refresh, and we're gonna get this party started. I am so delighted to be here. I'm so delighted to have this conversation of really thinking about what is the future. So those of you that are in the back, we're going to get started now with our conversation. In your bulletin, you have an amazing quote by Audre Lorde about caring for myself is not an self-indulgence. And it isn't. It's all about the preservation of us. And as we think about the future, we have to think about the future of us as well, because there's no future really without us. So as we have this conversation, I'm so delighted to have three presenters with me. Journee LaFond, who's an author, podcast host, and restoration justice activist, and executive director of Black Lives Matter Now, Black Lives Matter, New Hampshire. Forward Together, examining the intersection between queer and Black identity is her work. Also, we have with us, to my right, Amanda McGuire, a clinical mental health counselor whose work is embracing ourselves, body positivity, and self-care for queer BIPOC empowerment. And also, to my farther right, is Harold Stewart, the executive director of New England Foundation for the Arts, Boston, Massachusetts, whose writing and speech will be on voguing, transcending boundaries, and dismantling oppression. Their bios are in your program, so I won't read that, but we're going to get started here with Journee LaFond. Hi, dear. We wish you well. We're sending good vibes to you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us. And if you could start with your presentation on Forward Together, examining the intersection between queer and Black identity, that would be wonderful. Welcome, my dear.
Hello, everyone. I am Journee LaFond. My pronouns are they, them. I'm hoping you all can hear me. Can I get some thumbs
Yes,
up?
we can.
Okay, excellent, excellent. So as I said, my name is Journee LaFond. I'm really excited to be joining you all virtually today. I'm so sorry that I could not be there in person. I have been battling a recent bout of COVID. I'm not gonna hold you, it's kicked my ass a little bit. So I decided to stay home. I decided to stay home, but I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you. As Bethia very kindly introduced, I am the executive director of BLM New Hampshire. In addition to that, I'm a social worker with a degree from UNH, a concentration in child and youth development. And a lot of the focus of my career has been on queer youth and youth of color. I've been really fortunate to work with queer youth and queer adults in a few different ways in my career, through clinical work, community organizing, youth development, and now I get to do that through my work at BLM and some of the event planning things that I do. So I guess what I would say, I'm really passionate and really excited to have this conversation. As a social worker, especially one who works in a state like New Hampshire, it's been interesting meeting queer youth and Black youth who are queer in this state where Black people and queer people make only a fraction of the population. One of the things that I run into, especially when I'm doing clinical work, is the need for services, particularly mental health services, connection to community services that really speak to those points of identity. Unfortunately, and I think that this is something that we all see regardless of racial identity, gender identity, sexuality, mental health services and community services are really hard to come by. There are a lot of people who are in need right now, and honestly, there are not enough of us to provide. And I think that this gets amplified even further when you do have those other lenses of queerness, of Blackness to contend with. So living in a state like New Hampshire, I think the onus is really not just on us as social workers, as counselors, but also people who have influence in the community, who have points of entry in the community to foster some real change in terms of what resources do exist and how it is that we bring those to the people who are most in need. But that said, I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit on the panel. I do actually have a presentation for you, so I'm just gonna share my screen and we can get into a little bit of the meat of this. Just a second. All right, believe that's us there. All right, are we seeing that?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you so much. So, as was said before, the name of my presentation is For Together, Examining the Intersection of Queer and Black Identities. The reason that I chose to do this is because I found the overall topic of today's conference to be really interesting and really timely in terms of what's going on in the world. When I think about, excuse me, legislation and the conversations that are being had around being multiply marginalized, I think it's really important that we discuss not only the needs of this community, but also some of our history. Excuse me. Excuse me, doing great. Just a moment. I'd like to discuss our needs, but also our future. I'm just going to mute for a quick second.
You know what, Journee? We're going to come back to you. We're going to give you a moment for self-care because that's what we should be here to offer each other. And we're going to give you a moment to, and then I'll let you text us to let us know when you're ready to come back. But thank you for that introduction and thank you for that groundwork of helping us think, even for this panel, where are we going in forward thinking? So we're going to go to our next presentation for now. Embracing ourselves, body positivity and self-care for queer and BIPOC empowerment. Amanda. You want to go there?
I can see yours. That's fine. Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right, perfect. So this is something that's really near and dear to my heart. I've been doing a lot of self-exploration myself and just kind of unlearning all of the negative messages that we get from the world around us about us and our existence, especially if you inhabit a Black body or a queer body. I essentially work with body positivity and empowerment. I want to reject the nonsense that we aren't enough and that we have to spend so much money and time feeling more empowered about who they are and the body that they inhabit. One of my favorite things to talk about is boundaries. I love boundaries. I think boundaries are so important, but I also realize that boundaries are really difficult for people to set. Sometimes when you set boundaries for yourself, you end up changing relationships. You feel like you're in the wrong, but it just means that you're protecting yourself. You're standing up for yourself. You're being the person that you need to be. You're showing up for you. It's not just self-care, it's actually survival. And it's a way of saying that I choose me. So my boundary tips are to say no without guilt. I know people hate to say no. I know it feels weird to say no sometimes, but you're taking care of yourself. You know what you can handle. If you need a break, it's okay. Second boundary tip is to protect your mental space. Limit your exposure to negative body shaming or invalidating content. Thought about that, knew that was going to happen. Okay, well, anyway. So I talk about protecting your mental space as far as social media is involved. A lot of people on social media are selling us what capitalism tells us we need to look like, how we should behave, what roles we should be playing. If you are in a journey of self-acceptance, I strongly recommend finding creators that represent who you are, who you already are, not necessarily who you want to be. So I recently went through my Instagram and I found other plus-sized creatives. I found other Black and queer creatives. As a pansexual, I kind of feel like I fall into this weird donut hole sometimes, and I'm not sure the right way to be queer. But there is no right way. It's not, we're not defined into these tiny little boxes as much as people want us to fit in them. So I think that can be a really beautiful, lovely thing to embrace for yourself. It's freeing. Mindfulness and self-compassion. I think being aware of the negative messages that we tell ourselves, being aware when they pop up, because they're so automatic. We learned them when we're young, and they're just reinforced throughout our lifespan. So I like to recommend that if you are able to identify a negative message that you're giving yourself, to kind of hone in on it and to ask it, is this true? Am I really not a good person, or am I really less than for feeling this way?
Hmm.
And then challenge that. Ask yourself, what would happen if I didn't feel this way? What would I accomplish if I felt welcome in a space, in my body the way it is? And I think about fitness, I think about yoga classes and things like that, and how people that inhabit different bodies tend to stray away from those spaces out of fear of being ridiculed or looked down at. So I think it's really important to just kind of be gentle with yourself and say, yeah, all right, I'm at the gym. I don't look like those people, but I'm here for me. I'm doing this for myself. Challenging societal norms. That's a little bit what I was just talking about, but pushing back on how we're supposed to identify. And it can be lonely, it can be isolating. But I feel like, especially in New Hampshire, more communities have been popping up where people can feel accepted and loved and understood. And it's really great to kind of see that happening in real time. When I moved to New Hampshire, I did not expect to find a Black and queer community. So that has been a wonderful surprise for me. And I want to help foster that as best I can. So I have a little interactive exercise I wanted everyone to try. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. And what I would like for you to do is I'd like for you to imagine the person that you want to be without all of the social expectations. Who is that person? What does that person stand for? What are the dreams and hopes and goals of that person? What could you do if you didn't have these imaginary boundaries holding you back? And I just want to give you a second to really think about that. So what I'd like for you to do is take that image of yourself, and I want you to hold on to that and move forward with that the best you can. Remember, be gentle with yourself. It's not going to be 100% perfect right away. Keep in mind that you're unlearning a lifetime of capitalist bullshit. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. You are perfect the way you are. So thank you for listening. I did want to say that I do have a resource blog. It is for wellness, body neutrality, body positivity, and self-acceptance. And it is called The Waitlisted. The website is thewaitlisted.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram. And there are all kinds of resources for advocating for yourself and your health, for making sure that you're fed in a way that's, nourishing to your body. And yeah, just living your best life. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I appreciated that. I embrace you too.
Thank you.
What I appreciated about that embracing was not just embracing yourself, but embracing life, embracing being, embracing that future self as well. And I really appreciate it. I appreciate that exercise too. And speaking of that exercise and boundary setting, and thank you for bringing that to us. What we're going to do is continue to move to my good friend, Harold, and talk about boundaries a little bit more. And voguing is his presentation, Transcend Boundaries and Dismantling Oppression.
Thank you. It is important that these slides work, so I'm.
So are the slides working?
Okay, great. So I'll signal in the best way that I can. It's good that I studied theater and improv, so try to make it seem like we planned this the whole time. So first introduction slide, and while that's coming, I would just, first just say how grateful I am to be here in this space, to show gratitude for the organizers of this space, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and then the holders of this space with Southern New Hampshire University. My name is Harold Stewart. My pronouns are they and he. Most things, most days spoken in love. Today feels like one of those days. You can read my bio, but the most important thing that bio does not tell you, you may not surmise, is that I'm a safe, sex positive Southern sissy. And
All right now.
I know, they don't let me lead with that, so I sneak it in. And the Southern part of that means I grew up not even knowing my name or what a pronoun was, because I was sweet thing, baby. Or if my middle name was called, I was in trouble. So to kind of repair for that kind of trouble, I accept most things offered in love. I think to kind of speak to the NEFA side of this, because largely this will be kind of personal and some of my life's work, both in the region and as I have entered NEFA within the last year and some change, it'll hint at some of the things, the way I think about this at NEFA. But NEFA's mission, the New England Foundation for the Arts mission, is to invest in artists and communities and foster equitable access to the arts, enriching the cultural landscape in New England and the nation. I am really honored to kind of highlight and celebrate how NEFA is living in the room today. In addition to me being here, we have Randall over here, who was one of our pioneer arts administrators of color in a national fellowship that we was able to offer, representing Queer Elective and also New Hampshire. Audre is here, our regional program manager. So Audre, if you say hi, so they allowed me to do the setup. She actually has all the answers. She actually knows what's real at NEFA. It's my job to encourage you to some of our grant programs and initiatives. Speaking of those, House of Glitter, which is referenced in the program, is a recent grantee. And then also our newest grantee for a new program called Arts Here, where we are able to give about $72,000 in capacity building support, is to the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. So we're really grateful to kind of live also in this space in this way as NEFA. Next slide, please. I'm an indecisive queer Virgo in addition to a Southern sex positive, whatever I said before, which also means that the title of my talk seems to change as well. So, and I think it's all related, right? But there's a
a different way I think about maybe thinking about the theme that was presented. We like a good suspense moment, though. You know, and I should say I started my career in technical theater. So I have a lot of love and empathy and know y'all did everything right. It's been working all day and it waits to this moment to like not work. All right, we can go back a slide to the new title. It's not in your program, or if we can go back. But it's called Engaging the Black Audacity of the Queer Ego, Exploring Identity, Self-Expression, and Resistance. And I think most of what I want to spend my time doing before we get into discussion is kind of reflecting. We've heard a lot today. There's been a beautiful setup around some historical context and some ways in which we can be further connected and what freedom and justice might look like in this space for folks like us. So I offer this as a time to reflect largely, right? And maybe draw some points into some of the work that I've been blessed to be connected to. And part of that reflection is, you know, not necessarily what is Black audacity, but why do Black people have to be audacious, right? And I feel like in a room, I can make some assumptions that we understand this society's reliance on Black culture, and whether we're willing to admit it or not, then you have to be heavily reliant on the producers of that culture before it is assimilated and all of these other things. But there is this connection between the bold audacity of Black people, and I think it's something that, as you know, we look at this presentation that we should think about. And then also the queer ego, you know, what at the intersection of the queer ego, what might one think about? And we've held so much tension in this space. We've talked about so many realities and knowns, and I appreciate this panel allowing us not only space to breathe, but think about the future and maybe even smile a little bit, right? And I think that's what the queer ego offered us. It offers us a way to think about queerness as an asset and an asset only, right? So hopefully in these slides, what everyone else has said is real, and then also there's room for joy. There's room for us to only exist as an asset, and imagine what that might look like. So the slide that we're currently on, this is a good one, is some of the ways in which, as a theorist, I want to lift up the work that I've been able to do and think about it in a larger scheme. So I think of a lot of the work that I've been able to do as art as applied social science. I am happy not to be in a room full of artists who may be like, what does that mean? Social scientists know what applied social science is, and artists know what their practice is. And the struggle of queer theory that does not want to be defined because it wants to be transdisciplinary is like, it has no definition. It has multiple meanings, and the only way we can engage with it is what it might mean to you. So today I think about it in this way. Art as applied social science concerns itself with the psychological well-being and social welfare of individuals, communities, and society. And as a room full of folks across a lot of disciplines, you can understand that in social sciences is the birth and the current interactions of things like psychology, sociology, the humanities, and sometimes we put the arts there. And if you think about how those fields have been applied to give value, to invest in, and all the other ways, the application of those fields actually is what is the underpinning thing of this thing called oppression when we talk about identity. So if we can reimagine the role of art to not only concern itself with these things, but be applied in a different way towards our collective and individual liberation. Next slide, please. Queerness, something else that, you know, is defined over and over again, and it's really based on, I think, your experience and how you want to define it. Brandon Went, who is Canadian-born, disabled, beautiful, Black, and queer poet and artist, talks about it this way. Not queer like gay, queer like escaping definition, queer like some sort of fluidity and limitlessness at once. Queer like a freedom too strong to be conjured. Queer like the fearlessness to imagine what love can look like and pursue it. And I think Brother Justice was also uplifting some of these ideas and thinking about some of the collective work Brother Justice did, if we go to the next slide, and there was someone earlier who also invoked the beautiful ancestor Bell Hooks, who also takes an opportunity because there was a lot of speculation and people just wanted to know how she lived in love to define queerness in the moment. And what Bell Hooks says in the next slide is queer, not as being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as about the self that is at odds with everything around it, and that has to invent and create and to find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. So just expanding our understanding and connection of queerness to create more space for everybody in the room who lives at the intersection of what is normative, what is non-normative, and what is audacious can kind of situate us as we think about this topic. The next slide ask a very, very important question, I think, again, as I'm asking you to reflect. Who has societal and social psychological safety in the work that we create, teach, produce, support, and engage with? Next slide. When we think about art as applied social science and action, here's some visual connections that I think about it. The one picture where we see a beautiful trans angel next to what I would call very public art, right? A wall that many of us have seen and used through balloon text to really try to make a mass message. This message says, it wasn't about water fountains then, it's not about bathrooms now, right? And the positionality of this beautiful trans angel against that message and the effect of it. The other picture, last summer, I had the benefit of partnering with Actors Shakespeare Project when I was still at the Theater Offensive in Boston. The Theater Offensive is a 35-year-old entity, and during the last couple of years changed its mission to be a queer and trans people of color theater by mission. And in this partnership with Actors Shakespeare Project, I directed As You Like It. I directed As You Like It. If you remember anything about last summer, the queer narrative needed to be reclaimed. We were hearing all kind of things coming out of my sister embarrassment of a state called Florida. I'm from Texas, where Drag Queen Story Hour, somehow the narrative about Drag Queen Story Hour was not coming out of drag queen voices, or the trans narrative was not coming out of trans voices. And so they imagined and speculated a lot and just really lied to have some kind of collective political power. So when we were thinking about, how to think about Shakespeare in this moment, we imagined not only As You Like It as one big drag queen story hour, but to do it as gender expansive and queer as we possibly could. What you see right there is a picture of the character who led us through this drag queen story hour. And I have to say, I might need to resign as a theater director because I'll never get a headline like this one. It was the kind of production of As You Like It that could get the original text banned in the state of Florida, right? So living in that reality and living in so much meaning is some of the ways we think about art as applied social science. Next slide, and I probably need to go faster. So I'll try to speed up. We good? Okay. When I was at the Theater Offensive, when we changed our mission to become a queer and trans people of color organization by mission, it was essential that we understood that aesthetically. We had been living under a certain set of aesthetics, whether we had named them or not, for a number of years, but we needed to be intentional about, now that we've made this bold declaration of who we are aesthetically, who will we be? I'm at table 5, and it's the Dr. Locke table. And I think Dr. Lane Locke, amongst many things, identified as an aesthete, right? So when we think about the aesthetics movement, and if you studied it at school, aesthetes didn't stop existing after the white aesthetic movement. We can still reclaim aesthetics and talk about what's real in our lives and what we see and how we make meaning and make beauty. So we did that. This is an essay that I was able to contribute to that offering. Aesthetics are our constant, and they're also our consciousness, right? We constantly have, if you think about, Black movements throughout time, I always say, we're in a different cultural moment when Black women change their hair. That is always the signifier, right? Black women got a new hairstyle or went back to a throwback when shit is about to like pop off. The world is changing. Fashion, everything is all of that. But aesthetically, being a people who can have so much to offer and so much recreation. The next slide. And I use all this to reference, but I would encourage you to go to the Theater Offensive's website where a lot of this information consistently lives and you can read about it in more depth. But one of the things, again, because queer and trans people of color and Black queer and trans people, how often can we define from a position of power what our aesthetics are or what we would like them to be? So then it creates confusions in what we talk about in aesthetics because, again, we have not yet normalized talked about Blackness and queerness from a place of beauty. So reclaiming aesthetics and being able to redefine what is beautiful was some of the other things in this document that we had to make sure was known, because it may not look beautiful on the surface or it may not look beautiful to you, does not mean it's not aesthetically pleasing and claimed by us. Next slide. So for the next couple of minutes and towards the end, we'll just offer the 7 aesthetic characteristics that was community source, queer and trans community source. And I think they read like prayers, right? They read to me, when you say it out loud, like a call and response in church, a litany, when you are able to hear them. Because we did this with queer and trans people of color largely in Boston, even a way to talk about it, they said these are spells, right? Somebody said this is a spiritual moment. So when we even proclaim them and talk about them again, we talk about it as a spell. So let's look at the first one: wholeness, emotional risk, and tenderness. This is how the spell works. We take care of ourselves, we take care of each other, we take care of our people. Next slide. Unrealities, because the mortal world that we are forced to exist in, it's not real enough for us. So we reimagine a world that we have not yet encountered in the mortal world, but maybe we live there in the spiritual world. So unreality says this is how the spell works. We say what is real about our lives. We mold the clay of what is into what we need and glory at its beauty. Next slide. Space segregation, honoring the kitchens, piers, and community centers. We ain't always had the ability to build queer and trans physical spaces like theaters, but we've always found or created home as long as we have existed. I think our trans ancestor Swan, who was a revolutionary, actually, the research has shown we get what we understand as drag queen from a former slave who just would proclaim, I am the queen of drag, and would hold balls and all of those kind of things. So we've existed in whatever space that we could take over or that would have us. And many of times that was kitchens of our homes or other homes, the piers, the Chelsea piers in New York, and a lot of community centers have held us in this work. This is how the spell works. We make magic wherever we go, making do, making beautiful, and making the spaces our people most need. We remember and uplift the queer stories that have shaped this place. We make our own because we refuse to be disappeared or forgotten. The next slide holds the aesthetic of medicinal and healing. This is how the spell works. Our alchemy is in the marrow of our bones. We are born with the ability to heal ourselves and our kin, make way for the inclinations to begin. Next slide. Lineage and time travel. And this was one because, again, as people, even in this room, it feels important. Someone, I think the brother who gave Justice the award says we have to call out these names. We don't call them out. We shouldn't assume that those who are elders and ancestors will be called out, but they also dreamed of where we can make space for our own intervisions and visions and practice. So we see lineage and time travel as a beautiful collision, not in conflict with each other. And this is how that spell works. We remember where we come from. We honor the maps that they forge for. We remember who we come from. We honor the maps they forge for us through their magic, grief, revolts, triumphs, and joy. In their name, we conjure our own magic for ourselves, for each other, and for the ones that will come after. We are the portal and we are the destination. We are the prophets and we are the destiny. This is our birthright. Next slide. We're almost there. But hopefully you're, feeling kind of this moment and this beauty as a new set of aesthetics have been offered into this world and this future thinking. Edge and querying and ambidextrous. This is how the spell works. Taking flight requires standing on the edge of the precipice. The leap into the murkiness of the unknown is fecund and fertile. Next slide, and I believe this is the last one. You can read it as belonging, as one word, or you can also read it as belonging, the space that says we also have longings in spaces where we do belong, or spaces that we long to belong, or spaces that we'll never need to belong. But belonging should also encompass our longings. This is how the spell works. As a manifestation of our ancestors' longing, we be their longing made flesh. We ask and answer, whose am I and who is mine? Longing to be and see myself in the we, spinning the webs that reflect us to ourselves. Next slide. Think for some need for context, and again, we were asked to imagine and think about what's happening now that could be an indication of the future. And so for me, it lives in this space of the Black feminist prophets who have really prophesied it, the times that we are living in, even within their Blackness and their queerness. So we offer the next slide, another beautiful being into the room, Octavia Butler. And if you're familiar with Parable of the Sower, you know this work as to be speculative fiction, but now it's like, I don't know how much fiction it is. It just seems real right now. But it was classified when this book was written in 1993 as speculative fiction. So hold that date at 93 if you don't understand the prophecy that was in these parables, because it becomes very, very important. One reviewer on Medium, J-Rock, says Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler is eerily prophetic. Written in the 1990s, the novel paints a bleak vision of a near future America ravaged by climate change, economic disparity, and social upheaval. Near future where she wrote, near future when she wrote it, I'd argue that the day has already arrived, right? Is what this says. This book is written by what some may think are like diary entries because they are dated. And the first parable, if you go to the next slide, again, remember this is 1993, but the prophecy of Octavia Butler had imagined what would happen on July 20th, 2024. The introduction of that says, all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. And this is where something phenomenal happens. Octavia Butler says God is changed, repositioning our understanding of change to the spiritual world. Also proclaiming that by this time, we would be living in an era of change that Black queer women had prophesied it, right? But again, your relationship to change is indicated about your relationship to spirit. She says God is changed. So no matter what you worship right now, it is in this moment of change. She dates it July 20th, 2024. And many prophets of Octavia Butler wondered and anticipated what would happen on that day. And I would say so a lot of things happened on that day, but it's what happened the day after, where we was like, oh shit, maybe Octavia wasn't lying. Who knows what happened on July 21st, 2024, right? Biden makes a public announcement that he will not be,
Step down.
he would step down, right? Right? So wild, right? So living in this spiritual, the only thing I can say about this future moment, because again, I am a futurist and I also have to live in the present. There's something about the relationship to Black queer prophecy that we need to pay attention to, right? And many people, like they did at Octavia Butler's time, gave us every reason not to listen to this geeky, weird looking woman who's now is deceased. And I just, I wonder if heaven has a cell phone service for a lot of reasons, because I would just call up there and be like, what you got to say now? And, what you want to tell the people now? Finally, in this last slide, thinking about some of the work that we have been able to do at NEFA, another phenomenal queer genius, Toshi Regan, we were able to support the project that she has led, The Parable of the Sword, being turned into theatrical opera and touring throughout the country through our National Theater Project. So again, just to kind of highlight, our job is to support and to animate and make sure that there are resources available as queer and trans folks, as Black folks continue to lead us in this exciting future in the ways that they fit. So thank you.
Thank you. Let me just reach down and touch you. Because I knew exactly what happened. I was like, do I say it? I was like, are we talking about the election?
Oh, you can say, yeah.
It was
Somebody
like,
said this was church. Every Black church I go to,
know.
people are
I was
disruptive.
like, I
They
was
just
about to show
say what they
back.
want to say when
Right,
they
right. But I have to behave. So now we're gonna go back to our friend Journee. I hope that a little self-care, drank a little tea,
Had a little tea. Yep.
and we're gonna
that.
move forward together on that note. You know, as we think about the intersection of queer and Black identity, and we talked about the audacity of the beauty of us and how to embrace us. Let's take it home.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everybody's patience. Let me just get into presenter view here. Just a moment. So yeah, talking about the intersection. Oh Lord, here we go. The intersection of identity, that being Black identity, queer identity. From a personal standpoint, as I was saying before, living in New Hampshire and being a social worker who's trying to provide services to folks who live in that Venn diagram while also occupying that Venn diagram of myself, it presents some unique challenges. And I'm hoping through this presentation to address some of that by first taking us through some historical context and then sort of thinking about what that might mean for future action. So with that said, let's get into it. So the intersection, as I said, we're going to be talking about a few of the basic concepts of queer theory, some historical context, and then where those areas converge. So I know that I'm speaking to a room full of scholars here, but for anybody who maybe just needs a quick brush up on queer theory, the idea is it's a framework that emerged in the 1990s, and it challenges our more normative or heteronormative understandings of gender and sexuality. Some of the key tenets that I wanted to talk about today include deconstructing that normativity. So dismantling our idea of the binary, whether that is the binary of gender, right? The one that many of us grew up in with biology class, male or female, or the idea of heterosexual, homosexual, trans, cis, deconstructing what that means for us and how we move forward without the idea of either or. And that moves right into the fluidity of identity, right? If we are not living within a binary, what does that free us up to do in terms of the way that we operate, the ways that we navigate the systems around us, how we navigate our relationships, but also the not exactly simple, but the basic idea of how we see ourselves. How is it that we experience our reflection and the way that we perceive others? And then finally, that golden word intersectionality. Um, how do the many layers of our identity impact us in the way that we walk around in the world? So talking about race, class, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, etc. So the intersections between queer theory and Black culture, it represents this really rich field of study that explores all of those layers of identity that I was just talking about. One potential connection to this conversation is the overlap between gender equality, feminism, and Blackness. there have been a lot of debates within, and I think even outside of the Black community, in terms of what takes precedence: gender, race, sexual orientation. And within our community, which of those inequalities are we trying to address first? Do we need to address them first? And I think that a lot of us have been split. Excuse me. So there's been a long, long history of this discussion. It isn't a recent discussion. It isn't a new discussion, right? We can draw it back all the way to Maria Miller Stewart, right? Who like affirmed the place of Black women as abolitionists back in 1832, I believe, in Boston. There was the Combahee River Collective, right? And their statement on the intersection of race, sexuality, gender, class, all of those lenses, I think in 1977. There's Anita Hill, right? And the sexual harassment allegations against Clarence Thomas. Over and over again, you know, whether we're talking about even to take it away from politics or take it away from those hallmark moments, the conversation about rap, you know, and where are women supposed to be placed in rap? Should they be only the subject of rap songs? And if so, right, like how? Are we talking about women and those with femme identities as being objects? Are we talking about them being about there being like enmity? Are we going to accept Black female rappers into the lexicon? Like, is that, what does the role of femininity versus masculinity, to go back into a binary for a quick second, mean, especially as it pertains to Blackness? There's also the social difficulties that queer, excuse me, just gonna make sure we're good. Right, there are the social difficulties that queer and trans people of color experience, especially in the US. There was a survey by the Pew Research Center that said that only like 13% of Black Americans feel that society in general are accepting of trans people. This connects directly to the conversation around masculinity, femininity, the binary, and where it's placed. Just a moment.
Take your time.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I might have to slow down.
Take your time.
Excuse me. Whew. So, excuse me. Essentially, the survey came back saying that only about less than half, so 41% of Black people feel that transgender people and the issues surrounding them are changing at the right speed. While a third of Black people, and this is not just queer Black people, but in general, feel that the conversation and around trans experience is happening too quickly. Excuse me. What that shows me is a lack of consensus around queer and trans identity. And it makes me, excuse me, as a social worker, curious about why that is and how do we address it. So to go into a little bit about our culture, and I promise this is pertinent. If we're talking about queer theory in terms of Blackness, then we also need to talk about Black culture in terms of queerness. And I know that throughout the day, we've had a lot of really interesting conversations about Excuse me, just a moment. The cultural impact of queer and trans people of color, queer and trans Black people. For me, there are like three really key points that we need to talk about. Right, so we know that the Black community in general has really contributed quite a lot to the cultural zeitgeist, whether that's through music, food, literature, visual arts, fashion, language, etc. There's the contribution to the civil rights movement overall, and not just necessarily what was going on in the early 20th century, but the late 20th century and even before that. We have always been obviously at the forefront of the fight for racial equality. We've been so deeply involved in the struggle for sexual liberation. And we've also been at the forefront of the fight for portrayal of Black people and Black queer people in media. So one of the things that Harold said that really struck me was the idea of bringing ancestors into the room and speaking their name and sort of speaking their presence. And these are three people who, these are two people, I didn't get to add the third one because they're coming up later. But these are two people who really speak to me in terms of their contributions to culture through a queer and Black lens. Right, so we have queer Black activism, and here, excuse me, highlighted, we have, excuse me, Mother Marsha P. Johnson, and also mentioned is Baird Rustin, illustrating activism for racial justice, as well as inclusion for LGBTQ plus rights. And I know that I don't necessarily have to give you all a history lesson in terms of Stonewall or the civil rights movement in order to highlight how important these figures were. I mention them because history often forgets to mention the multiple layers of identity that are present here, and just how hard queer people of color and queer Black people specifically go for their culture. There are, of course, artists like James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, who explored those themes of race and sexuality in their work, challenged societal norms constantly. And there are many people, our contemporaries, many people who are even in this room or this virtual space, who do exist with that complex relationship with queerness and with Blackness, and experience the point where cultural values might conflict with our identity. And there are so many people here who are dedicated to fostering spaces, not just for acceptance, but for what I think of as elevation and moving forward. I talked a little bit earlier about representation. And the reason that I want to talk about representation is because it really is essential to fostering those spaces that we're talking about. Earlier, before my first coughing fit, I mentioned the need for bringing resources to people where they're at, to creating spaces for queer people of color, for queer Black people, for trans people. And I think that it's just the reality of our culture, of many, that a lot of the conversation around doing so starts with the acceptance, though I shy away from that word, and normalization of the conversation around queerness and what that means, and to be navigating both of these experiences. And so if we are going to not only try and foster programming, for example, for queer people of color, we need to make sure that these people are aware, are accepted, are seeing themselves through our media, whether that's music, literature, television, and making sure that not only are people seeing themselves, but they're seeing authentic stories that center not only their pain, but their joy, and maybe even just their ability to be normal, their ability to be mediocre. And when I say they, I include myself in this conversation. But for anybody here who is here as an ally, these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about when we talk about representation and what that means. I can't express to you the impact of being able to see a trans person on the television who is experiencing, I don't know, trouble finding a job, or queer Black people who are, I don't know, navigating an empty nest, the normalcy of life, and also like presenting the picture of people who are trans, who are queer, having a life that is not centered around tragedy, that isn't necessarily on display, sequins and glitter and whatnot, although I love me some sequins and glitter. I didn't mention that I'm also a drag queen. So there's that. Um, I need to see, and I think that we need to see people just having regular struggles.
Yes. Yes.
Excuse me. So moving forward, these are some of the things that I wouldn't be a social worker if I didn't have a call to action. These are some of the things that I want to see us discussing,
Yep.
especially within our communities and our points of entry. And these are things that I want to see us discussing as Black femmes, as Black men, as queer people as well. Because yes, it's important for our allies to discuss these, but if we want to see some real change, especially for queer young people and trans young people who are coming up, we're gonna have to hold ourselves accountable. So the first one being misogynar, and I'm sure many of you have heard this term before, but if you have not, the idea of misogynar is similar to misogyny, but it is specific to Black women or Black femininity. It's a dislike of, contempt for, or ingrained prejudice against Black women or Black femininity.
Mm.
And the initial definition stopped at Black women, but I added Black femininity because misogynar does not just impact Black women or people who are perceived to be Black women. Unfortunately, this specific brand of misogyny impacts people who are Black and display any type of femininity. And so this can impact Black men as well, who are considered to be effeminate in any way. And unfortunately, it degrades the conversation around identity and overall perceived value within our movements, because there is so much threat perceived to masculinity when femininity is present.
Mm.
I've been really happy to see lately many conversations around what people are calling toxic masculinity.
Mm.
What I would love to see is us take a step forward and figure out how toxic masculinity harms the femmes in our culture, the masked people in our culture, and how we leave those old concepts of masculinity that perhaps minimize our emotions, minimize our ability to have intimate relationships, and really degrade the idea of femininity. I would love to see us leave that behind. But first, we have to have the difficult conversation. Second, homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, the prejudice against people within those identities. I know that there are very few people in this room, and again, in this virtual space, who have come here, excuse me, without at least a sprinkling of religious trauma. I call myself out in that too. And I think a lot of us, perhaps grew up sitting on those church pews and realized, you know what, I think something might be a little bit different about me. And either had to decide, am I going to share that with someone, or am I going to hold on to that? If I do share that with someone, is the someone I'm sharing it with safe.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, that has not always been the case. A lot of us do come out or maybe even just hint at being different in this way and are met with fear, judgment, sometimes threats, sometimes emotional or even physical violence. A lot of us lose the connections that the church is meant to build. And that's not to say that religion is the only contributing factor to homophobia within our community, more to highlight that it is perhaps our religious communities, our church homes that might benefit the most from having those conversations around homophobia and how that again impacts and then hurts their own communities. That said, homophobia is rampant within and outside of our Black community. I urge all of you to find, excuse me, your entry points, whether that is your conservative relative, your religious friend, you know, your perhaps just older and maybe not as aware people in your circle, and start having those conversations around the seed of homophobia or the seed of misogyny, or even the seed of racism or internalized racism, internalized anti-Blackness. Because
Journey,
it's,
can we
yes,
stay on this slide for a moment?
yes.
I think what you have brought into the room is at the root of many things. And I think if you don't mind, I would love to use this slide as the beginning of getting into this discussion.
We can
Because
absolutely.
these three things that you have mentioned are about belief systems
Mhm.
that we are born with, that we acquire, that we take on these belief systems. And I love the fact that you actually brought in men also into the conversation. So, Journee, you have given us so much here, but can we just stay with this for a moment, if you don't mind?
I absolutely, yes. This is actually, I think, my last slide, so we can go right into the
Oh,
conversation.
I didn't know that. I didn't.
Yeah,
We didn't practice that.
we didn't practice that. So it's
We
good
did
timing.
not, because I just wanted us to take this in for a moment.
Yeah.
This belief system about ourselves, about others. And as Audrey had pointed out, I'm sorry, Amanda had pointed out, I'm looking at Audre Lorde, sorry.
Yeah.
But Amanda had pointed out about the imaginary boundaries. But for Audrey, this gets in the way of us taking care of ourselves. And if we can't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of others. If we don't love ourselves first, we're not going to love other people later. If we are afraid of love, how can we be audacious and see beauty?
Yeah.
So that's why, Journee, this slide kind of hit me the most. And even starting with this misogynoir.
Mhm.
And Harold, and I'm sorry, I wanted Harold to speak to this because I think we talk a lot about Black women,
Oh,
a lot, right?
Right.
And
yes.
Black mothers and the feminine spirit. But what about Black men? What
Mm,
about men? And why, where do we go in this beauty of us, in this audacity
mm.
to embrace all of it, the masculine side, without the toxic part? How do we do that?
Mm. All right.
All right.
Stop sharing.
Sorry, that was not one of the pre-prepared questions I
I
haven't
know,
answered.
but neither was your
So
slides.
here we go. Here we go. I know we getting each other back. You got your back. I think again, one, to just really take a moment, because I believe in the breath work. I just want to just take a moment and reflect on what we've all had to offer to this point and just
Yes.
appreciate and affirm so many prolific and wonderful thoughts. And so much is titillating here. So I'm like, what's the question? Okay, I think I got the question. I'm representing like misogyny right now.
No,
Okay. Or speaking to the voice of like, okay, but I mean, it's real, right? You know, no, it's no.
The positive.
Yes.
Show us
Yeah,
where we should
yeah.
go.
So I think a couple of things when we talk about misogyny noir connected to some of the thought that I had, but again, amplified, Moya Bailey, who writes that into existence as a Black queer woman,
Okay.
right? You know, so I think we just need to set that
Okay.
in the room. Again, we're still talking about Blackness at the intersection of femininity and then also at the intersection of like prophecy and audacity, because Moya Bailey, as I understand it, who again is quite skilled in women's study, gender study, femininity, could talk about a lot of different things, could uplift the work of Lloyd, but also says, I have to speak now to Black brothers and Black masculinity. Like that's what I need to do with my time. And I think, you know, you had also mentioned this thing about like hate, right? And I think if we look at toxic masculinity or masculinity in its limitlessness or its misunderstanding of self, right? It is speculative ways that it thinks it exists and it is accomplishing something, that it is too a myth, just like gender, like white supremacy and all of those things, that they're all speculative and they have to be able to be instituted in the way, and the root of it, right, as I understand it, is like white supremacy is the glue that holds any system of oppression together, right? So our masculine being may be connected to this speculative idea of supremacy that we've learned and inherited from white people, right? And it only gets roots if someone believes it and has the ability to enact it. So you have to look at, you know, Black men and Black masculine spaces have to exist so we can examine this stuff. But Malcolm X puts it this way: who taught you to hate yourself, first of all?
That's right.
So we have to understand the learned behavior. And then we also have to reimagine, and the reason I love lifting up Black feminist thought, because it is subversive and it also creates a way. And Bell Hooks also wrote, you know, We Real Cool, Black Man on Masculinity, and I forget the subtitle, where we come to understand these things through a feminine lens. But we also have to, if we also understand masculinity and femininity as a spectrum, it's not based on gender, then men, cis, and masculinity, we also get to be feminine, right? And I think it's really getting in touch with some of those things. And then I think we need to highlight where we're seeing, you know, because just like racism ain't gonna be over tomorrow or ever, neither is some of the kind of masculine ways of the toxic masculinity that it exists. So we don't need to highlight these things as self-congratulatory, but there's a lot that's working. Black men are beautiful in this, right? Marcus Garvey said, Black man, you were once great, you shall be great. Black men are great in this moment. And that comes with not only an acknowledgement with a vast responsibility, but we have to be, the key to it is we have to be in relationship to each other. We have to learn how to love each other and coexist in this world. And anybody who's navigating masculinity has to admit the masculinity is not the powerful source that it claims to be, or the most powerful source that exists. Femininity, we will always bend to the will of femininity, right? It happens in the Bible, it happens in all of these things. So it's a false notion to think that even when you occupy masculine space, you're the most.
But we're not talking, explore this a little bit more. And I want to go to Journee for a moment, because to Harold's point, if we're all just on a spectrum, right? So that means within women, there's a bit of masculinity, right? And so how is it when we think about emerging movements or trends in the queer community, what is that future self or part of masculinity that can lend itself to where Harold is, where both are beautiful, and what's holding us back?
Well, I agree with Harold that both aspects are beautiful. Masculinity and femininity, I feel, are intrinsic to our existence. We can't exist without them. What I will say is that in my mind, looking forward, we're shedding not masculinity, we're not shedding femininity and leaning to one side or the other. The idea is to shed what exists around those ideas that is harming us, the toxic masculinity and the toxic femininity that I was talking about earlier. So if there are aspects of your masculinity, and this is just the general you, if there are aspects of your masculinity that are harming you or harming the community that you exist in, such as, you know, maybe an inability to access those emotions. Again, I'm a therapist, I'm a social worker. That's where my brain goes first, right? Is yeah, emotional well-being. Example, if you're unable to access those emotions, or if you see others accessing those emotions and perceive that as a threat, then how is that serving you and how is that serving your community that you exist in?
Mm.
If you are in your feminine energy and unfortunately that leads you to feel that you are in competition with others who are in that feminine energy, how is that serving you or the community that you exist in? So when I think about us moving forward, I think about us elevating our ideas of femininity and masculinity. As a non-binary person, I feel like I reside in both of those.
Mm.
But the onus is on me as a human being to figure out how I can exist in both of those while doing the least amount of harm to myself or the people around me. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate that because Amanda, you had talked about in your presentation embracing
Mhm.
and embracing ourselves and how that makes us more aware. But how
Yeah.
does this, how do we move this forward?
So just thinking about what Journey just said about embracing the masculinity. As a Black woman, I never really felt feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of when I started questioning my sexuality because it was like, well, I don't fit into that box, but I also don't fit into this box. So who am I? And I think being able to accept myself as being kind of more in the middle, not hyper feminine, though sometimes I can be hyper feminine. Sometimes I can be really masculine, you know, just going with it and just kind of tossing the binary away, and not being afraid to not present in one specific box. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense a great deal because I think many Black women fit that, right?
Yep.
Because we are socialized that feminine is very Eurocentric,
Right.
very blonde,
Yeah.
very childlike talking,
Delicate,
delicate.
soft voice, being treated with kid gloves. And I feel like Black women are
You can cry.
right. You can cry, but Black women are not treated.
No, we're
that way.
loud.
Yeah. Angry,
Yeah.
obnoxious.
Mean face.
I mean, I've been out in restaurants talking to friends. And I've had people turn around to look at me, and it's like I'm not talking any louder than anyone else. It's just you're a Black person in a space, and it's like
Or
so
or you have a voice that says, listen to me.
right, which is
Or sometimes you're told on the phone, yes, sir. No, I'm a woman. Excuse me, sir. I'm
right.
a woman.
Uh-huh.
What, sir? No, I'm not a child. I'm a woman.
Right, exactly.
So when we think about that, I think, you know, the and we had talked about this a little bit when we were on our call. Sometimes some of this can lead to the muse of us rather than the fullness of us. That people see us as a muse, as something to riff off of, to copy, to whatever. How do we use this moment to look at the power of us and use these strong identities that we've put forth to really move the narrative on power, politics, and money?
Hmm.
Because it's great to talk about this in the art sense, but how do we move beyond artsy and cute
Hmm.
to move to real power, politics, and money? Harold, what's your thought? Because I know you got a thought.
I got a good one on this one. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm making up for the first one. No.
It's fun.
Because yes, you know I'm a Virgo, so throwing me off, I just get real thrilled.
But you
But it was beautiful. But so I would also say no. I appreciate the throw off to get because it allows us to be present, I think, to the moment and be present to the conversation. So that's where I'm like, be present
And we love you.
to the conversation. And there's this thing called subversive masculinity, like that I think study in my work. That like if masculinity has to exist, does it has to exist in the same way? And even in my art collection, it's just, or even me, it's just, what does it mean to be in this body and look masculine, but also have on a pink hat?
That's
You know,
right.
so these interesting interventions that I like because it keeps them guessing. To the point that you were just taking about this idea of the muse and how do we claim power, and Harold is full of Black feminist quotes. The one that I love the most in this moment comes from Toni Morrison when she says the function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. I actually call that whole speech in the moment that she gave in 1975, the Black Artist Declaration of Independence. And it's not what racism is as it defines, like how does it function in the world? The same way you can say, how does masculinity function in the world? And a lot of these things function as distractions, which means we spend a healthy amount of our time explaining our reasons for being and why we exist and why our hair is. But what Toni Morrison says in his quote, she said, you don't have to do that anymore. You can talk directly to me, right? And so for Harold, what that means to reclaim power is that I know we're in a mixed room and I know that there's a lot of beauty in this room. I haven't altered my presentation. I'm saying the exact same thing that I would say if this room was exclusively Black, because that's who I need to speak to in this moment. And I don't have to explain or allow racism and other things to function as this distractive teaching tool and only exist there, even though we're on a college campus. So I think if we take the opportunity to speak directly to each other in the ways that we would, you know, so if you say girl in that space or Miss Thing, and you know what I'm saying, just use it and speak directly, then again, you affirm this kind of power. And really you never lose it because you don't subvert the narrative enough to like alter it for a mixed crowd. And as someone whose work has been race-based, as long as I understood what race has been, I have to deal with the tension of that because if Toni Morrison, and we call her Queen Mother, says that racism function as a distraction, and so much of my work has been based on race, she actually says it keeps you from doing the work. While I must tend to the necessary distraction right now because I have that positional power, I also have to figure out what my other work is, right? That's not talking about racism directly. It could be positioning myself in the spirit of joy, right? And all of these other things, because I think that's the new, you know, that's the move that America won't let Black people participate in. Black joy has always been the threat. And I think, you know, and finally, this when I think of freedom in this moment and what it means to this body, Harold Stewart, I've come to say that freedom is equal access to joy. So that's the goal, right? That's the psychological safety. So you can think you have given me something like an executive director position that I've earned, and I'm just like, nope, that was, you know, that's an earned thing. That's not freedom. Maybe progress, but do I have equal access to joy in this space, right? And then we can operate on some of those things. So I think that's how, you know, power is not only claimed but sustained.
Can I add something to that?
Ask him.
Yeah, this is yes.
I've noticed lately on social media that I've been seeing videos of Black boy joy or men frolicking and things like that, and it's just amazing to see Black men just kind of drop that masculine costume, you know what I mean, and really just embrace joy and freedom and happiness.
Yeah, I think again, because I have to start with a quote that guides me. And actually, your question now, like that Black masculinity thing, you were onto something. So I'm gonna trust you. Because another hero of mine, and the book that you'll see that I'm in, answering Joseph Call about Black gay genius. Joseph Bean said, you know, Black men loving Black men was a revolutionary act of the 80s. And people interpreted that in a lot of ways, but because he was what they would call in that time a same gender loving Black men, they thought that he was just talking about Black gay men. But what's revolutionary is Black men's relationship to love in a like father to son relationship, a brother to brother relationship, two brothers frolicking, you know, in the field kind of relationship. And that was the revolutionary act of the 80s. And I think it's still like revolutionary today, because you get to see Black male existence and Black masculinity exist in a way that, you know, has not been socially acceptable, but it's always been there, right? It has always been there. And to, again, wrap it back up to that other quote is that, again, it's always been there. Why hasn't it been functioning in a way? Because we've been tending to the distraction.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think I was fortunate to have a father that was revolutionary, that would frolic with us, that loved my brothers deeply and loved his brothers deeply. And I think that was the asset of my family that allow us to be who we are. So as we're thinking about this asset of liberation, this asset of seeing this, naming this, Harold, I am going to go to you for a minute. How does that show up in the arts? And then Journee, I want to know, how is this showing up in the movement? And Amanda, I want to know, how does that show up in Deep Self? So how does this show up in the arts? This vision of radical love of self and others without care of gender.
So again, I think if artists are reclaiming a narrative and also not responding to how these systems function, meaning art only exists to tell our oppressor where they hurt us, how they hurt us, right? Then you see all different kind of projects that we're seeing, I think, through NIFA and other, you know, that aesthetic work. What I loved about the aesthetic work for the theater offensive is that it does not mention white people. It does not, you know, I just had this assumption. My theory was, okay, we're going to set these aesthetics. We're talking about queer liberation. And so much of it would be centered around the ways in which we are oppressed. And it's like, no, I cry reading that because I'm just like, it is a litany. It is a prayer, you know, and all of those things. And now I'm able to see some of the artists interpret that into their work, right? And it has literally changed what it means to transcend form and think about what is medicinal quality of my work. If I'm just thinking about it for myself, you know, how am I being ambidextrous? What am I querying and all of those things? And so it's a different set of projects that I would say maybe in our panel process and where we have to communicate to people who are deciding that this is also relevant and it's also beautiful and it's quite revolutionary, you know, and in a place like New England, it may not speak to the desires of everybody, right? Who wants to encounter it as and engage with it, but it is speaking directly to it. And sometimes it's not even words, right? So you see theater works that are based on movement, right? Because that's the only way I know how to express, you know, all of these kind of things. So it's really changing what has been dominant forms of artwork to allow art that has been in the fringes to kind of take space. Our job is to like advocate for it, resource it, say, yeah, this is valuable. It may not get written up in the New York Times, but there are other ways in which this art that is being redefined, it's not Eurocentric, it's not heterocentric, is, you know, the art of this time and this moment.
People-centric. Love-centric.
It's human-centric, it's idea-centric. It's the other thing too is that, you know, and I think about this a lot now that I'm in philanthropy, how much have we invested in people's ability to fail, to get it wrong? Just so, you know, so it's not even about like, oh, you have all the answers. So who has residencies to explore and to research and say, you know, I thought that was the best idea I had since sliced bread. We need to scrap that, right? You know what I'm saying? But we need, but not give up on like trying again, because this is all based on ideas. So I think right now, the beauty of it is we can connect to this moment as it is immersion and an exploration. But once queer and trans people of color and Black people start solidifying some of these freaking ideas, mind blown.
And I think that is something that each and every one of us can take away. Where are we putting our time, talent, treasure? And how do we not take it away when there's a learning opportunity? And keep that moving forward. Journee, what is your thought? And how do we move this forward?
Well, similarly to Harold kind of speaking on the art aspect of things, I think within the movement, and I'm thinking about grassroots movements, nonprofit work and such, we're seeing a turn toward like a decolonization, right? A decentering of whiteness and heteronormativity in terms of how we are structuring movements, organizations, initiatives. And it's been challenging at times, but I think it's also a joy because it allows us to embrace, again, the process of mistake making and of innovation, and allows us to really dig into new ideas in a way that hasn't been done before, at least has not been, I think, is widely accepted.
Mm.
One of the things that I'm really excited about, for instance, with BLM is the ability to do this work in terms of creating opportunities for mutual aid, education, and really having those deep conversations about like recidivism and all of these things in a way that is really led by us,
Mm.
rather than having to check off the boxes, for
Mm.
instance. And I think that if we can keep doing that, we're going to see some really excellent change. It might be my training, but I get so excited about thinking about young people sort of taking up the mantle later on and being able to be like, you know what, I have had this rich history of ancestors and of elders who have done so much fighting to get me to a place where I can say, here I am, I'm showing up as authentically as possible.
Mm.
That is my queer and Black identity or otherwise. My dogs get to show up authentically as well. Right? um, but I love the idea of us creating a space where they can be like, this is my idea.
Right.
These are the resources. I know I have a mentor. I know I have
Right.
financial resources and whatnot. It's all been cultivated. Here I go. It's exciting. And I think that's how we move forward.
And from your thoughts, Amanda, of moving ourselves forward in a self-care space, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think radical self-acceptance is an act of rebellion, just openly and freely existing in a way that's authentic to you. I also acknowledge that that's not always safe, and that's where community comes into play.
Mm.
There's safety in numbers. I think we also have to look at the way we look at ourselves, the things we don't like about ourselves, especially as Black people, and call it out when we're feeling that way about other Black people or organizations. Just be aware that, am I being too harsh or too critical because of this internalized self-hatred? And once it's acknowledged, then you're able to actually work through it and move past it. But you have to acknowledge it. You have to call it out. You have to acknowledge that it exists. So yeah, I think radical self-acceptance, awareness, community, and of course, activism.
I appreciate that. And now we're going to open it up to hear all the radical thoughts from each and every one of you and questions that you may have for our amazing panelists before we wrap this up. We have one microphone. So are there any questions or thoughts or discussions that we would like to take from the audience? So as the mic is moving around the room, there are a couple of things that I want to talk a little bit more about as we think about trends. Harold, you had mentioned some of the art trends that you're seeing. What other art trends can we get involved with? The audience here, what can we do to help be a part of this movement going forward?
Yeah, I think, picking up on understanding that Black queer artists are in a mode of exploration. Many in their practice will invite community members, audience members to be a part of that development journey. So I would say don't only seek out to see a final project. See if someone has invited you into process with them, right? Which is a very, very generous act, I must say. But see if you can be in that space with process with them, and whatever that means. Sometimes it's just supporting it. Like, how can I support process and give thought and understand what is asked of me in that moment, right? Art does not exist in a vacuum. And even the creation of art does not want to exist in a vacuum. It wants to find community at
Right.
multiple. So I think we have to create a space, both artists and viewer, to say this is also a safe space for exploration and those things. You know, artists want to create work. People who want to champion our work, we welcome the championship of the work. So do that in spaces. You know, next year this conference might not have queerness as a central theme, right? But think about how these conversations show up and how queer people show up and queer artists show up, even if we're not the central idea, right? You know, if we've had some kind of shared learning there. And then, you know, I would be remiss, and I definitely wouldn't be a cultural organizer if I wouldn't think about what's needed in the advocacy space,
Yeah.
in the policy arena, right? In the space of the electorate, and all of those kind of things where, again, it'll be a rare day in this heaven on this earth before Harold Stewart shows up again to try to explain himself to somebody or to try to legitimize a life that I'm just trying to live. And I think that's the work of somebody else to say, no, that ain't threatening, right? Drag Queen Story Hour is one of the most beautiful offerings that drag queens have given this society. To place themselves, you know, literally at the feet of children, to share story. And I, like, you know, we couldn't have imagined that way to animate character and humanity. So it's not the job of the drag queen to tell people who are moving with some kind of misunderstanding that this is the most beautiful offering to me, my family, and my child. Because simply that person just wants to read the story, right? And not have to defend the naysayers.
So I think we don't have a question. Journey, and as you think about the future and particularly where you are with Black Lives Matter, what is the pipeline that we need to support? What does that pipeline to the future look like?
I always feel firmly that any conversation around what we can call radical change starts with education, having a conversation. I mentioned in my presentation that a lot of this is going to start with normalizing a conversation around identity, but not just identity. We don't need to talk to death, who am I, to everyone else. And we, as Harold said, we don't need to justify who it is that we are to other people. When I think about the conversation, though, I think about, all right, well, if we're going to talk about the rights of people to be married, to stay married and to get benefits from their spouses, to use the bathrooms that fit with how they identify, to be on sports teams and things like that. If we're going to be having those conversations, we need to be having them frequently and openly. We need to be having them in a way that feels safe, not only to us, but in a way that allows for curiosity, hopefully in well-meaning ways. And we need to be willing to have those conversations even when it's uncomfortable. My hope would be that as we get a little bit closer to whether it's this election, local elections, the next one, my hope would be that we get more comfortable with the idea of people living their lives in a way that doesn't necessarily have to match ours, and that being okay. That just being okay. So I guess if I had to sum it up, I would say I would love for us all in the future and looking toward the future to get real comfortable minding our own business.
I'll say it.
And I love that. And to get comfortable in minding our own business, we got to love our business. So Amanda, my last question for you. What is the new mantra or the new affirmation that we need that allows us to be comfortable with ourselves enough that we simply can mind our own business?
Yeah, that's a tough one. um, Yeah, I don't know. You know, when I think about it, and I think about, is it Gen Alpha now? There's so many generations now, I can't keep up. But when I look at them and I look at how they're so open and accepting and aware and informed, I think they're kind of our hope in a way, right?
Mm.
You know, they're not growing up in the same environments and with the same rules that many of us
Mhm.
grew up with. Just the fact that a 15-year-old can have a friend like, okay, you know, no
And your
questions.
parents have to accept it.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think we have to look at the youth, and I think we have to embrace their openness, except for the throwback 90s fashion that can go away. But everything else, please, no more stirrup leggings. Yeah. So that's my thought. Embrace the future. They're different than us, but that's a good thing.
It is.
They've also shaken off a lot of this garbage
Yep.
that we've been carrying around for decades.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This panel was entitled A Burst of Life, and I really feel a burst of light. And I feel like this was more like an illumination of life. Like we had a dimmer that got turned up. And hopefully you're going out of this room seeing things a little differently, thanks to Journee LaFond and her work, but also her presentation of moving forward together, Amanda McGuire and Embracing Ourselves. And Harold, I tried to write down your new presentation.
Black audacity. The black audacity of the queer ego.
The Black audacity of the queer ego. I'm hoping that you've taken away from this conversation something that you didn't know before, but more importantly, a better sense of self, yourself, other selves, to the point that at the end, you can mind your own damn business. Thank you, everyone. And thank you.
Messiah.